The harsh winter of 1876 swept across the Dakota Territory with unforgiving fury, bringing with it the coldest temperatures in living memory. It was during this merciless season that Rebecca Mitchell found herself alone in a tiny cabin at the edge of the Black Hills, miles from the nearest settlement. With her husband 3 months dead from pneumonia and supplies dwindling by the day, Rebecca's hope was fading as quickly as the daylight when a gravely wounded Lakota chief collapsed at her doorstep. The decision she made in that moment would forever alter the course of 2 vastly different lives and challenge everything she thought she knew about courage, loyalty, and belonging. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The wind howled through the cracks in the cabin walls like a hungry wolf seeking entry. Rebecca Mitchell pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders and stoked the dwindling fire, watching as the precious logs crumbled into glowing embers. 3 months earlier, she'd had a husband, a future, and a dream of building a prosperous homestead on this plot of land her husband Thomas had claimed with such pride. Now she had only uncertainty, grief, and the constant companion of solitude. The Dakota Territory winter had descended earlier than anyone had predicted, catching even the most experienced settlers off guard. Thomas had succumbed to pneumonia before the first heavy snow, leaving Rebecca alone with their half-built dreams and dwindling supplies. The nearest settlement, Fort Galloway, was 15 miles away, a distance impossible to traverse in the current conditions. Rebecca's gaze drifted to the small table where she kept her journal, her one luxury from her previous life in Philadelphia. The daughter of a schoolmaster, she'd been raised with books and learning, ill-prepared for the harsh realities of frontier life, yet she'd embraced Thomas's vision of a new beginning in the West, where land was plentiful and opportunities unlimited. "We'll build something that's ours alone," he'd promised, as they'd left behind the crowded streets of the city. Now those words echoed hollowly in the empty cabin. She moved to the window, wiping a clear patch in the frost-covered glass to peer out at the blinding whiteness. The snow had stopped momentarily, though dark clouds on the horizon promised more to come. With supplies running low and no way to reach Fort Galloway, Rebecca had begun to accept that she might not survive until spring. The sound came suddenly, a dull thud against her door, so unexpected in the isolation that she nearly dropped the cup of weak tea she'd been nursing. For a moment she stood frozen, certain she'd imagined it. Then it came again, followed by what sounded like a groan. Rebecca's heart hammered in her chest. Bears were known to approach cabins during harsh winters, driven by hunger. Or perhaps it was one of the trappers who sometimes passed through these parts, though rarely in winter. "Who's there?" she called, her voice sounding thin in the vastness of the silence that followed. No answer came, only another faint sound, more human than animal. Rebecca reached for Thomas's rifle, which hung above the fireplace. She'd fired it only a handful of times, and never at anything living, but its weight in her hands provided a small measure of courage. Cautiously, she approached the door, the rifle held awkwardly before her. Taking a deep breath, she unbolted the lock and pulled the door open a crack, the bitter cold immediately biting at her face. What she saw made her gasp. Collapsed on her threshold was a man, his dark hair frosted with snow, his buckskin clothing stained with blood that had frozen in dark patches. But it wasn't just any man. Even in her isolated existence, Rebecca recognized the ceremonial paint marks on his face and the distinctive beadwork on his clothing. This was a Lakota warrior, and from the elaborate feathered headdress, half buried. In the snow beside him, one of significant status, Rebecca stood paralyzed with indecision. The newspapers she occasionally received from Fort Galloway were filled with accounts of tensions between settlers and the Lakota, disputes over territory, and broken treaties. Thomas himself had spoken warily of the Indian problem, as he'd called it, though they'd seen no native people near their homestead. The man groaned again, his breath forming small clouds in the frigid air. He was clearly gravely injured, and despite her fear, Rebecca couldn't ignore the human suffering before her. Setting the rifle aside, she knelt beside him. "Can you hear me?" she asked, knowing he likely wouldn't understand her words. The man's eyes fluttered open briefly, revealing pain-clouded dark irises that focused on her face for just a moment before closing again. His breathing was shallow, and now that she was closer, Rebecca could see the extent of his injuries, a deep gash across his side that had soaked his clothing with blood, and what appeared to be a bullet wound in his shoulder. A wiser woman might have closed her door, might have remembered the stories of settlers who had shown kindness only to meet violent ends. But Rebecca had never claimed to be wise. Thomas had often teased her about her stubborn compassion, which extended to injured birds and stray dogs alike. With a decision that would reshape her future in ways she couldn't possibly imagine, Rebecca set down the rifle and, summoning all her strength, dragged the unconscious Lakota chief into her cabin. The next hours passed in a blur of activity as Rebecca drew on half-remembered nursing skills from helping her mother tend to ailing neighbors. Back in Philadelphia, the man remained unconscious as she cut away his frozen, bloodied clothing to reveal the full extent of his injuries. The bullet had passed clean through his shoulder, which was fortunate, but the gash along his side was deep and angry, the edges showing the early signs of infection. Rebecca worked methodically, first cleaning the wounds with her precious supply of whiskey, meant for medicinal purposes and saved for emergencies. She stitched the side wound with trembling hands, using her sewing needle sterilized in the fire and thread meant for mending clothes. Throughout the procedure, the man remained mercifully unconscious, though occasional groans told her he felt the pain even in his unaware state. When she had finished tending to his wounds, Rebecca faced a new dilemma. The cabin had only one bed, hers. After a moment's consideration, she covered it with clean cloths to protect the bedding, and with great effort managed to move the Lakota chief onto it. He was tall, with the lean, muscular build of a man accustomed to physical exertion. His face, now cleared of snow and some of the ceremonial paint, revealed strong features and the weathered complexion of someone who lived his life under open skies. As she covered him with quilts and stoked the fire to ward off the chill that could kill as surely as his wounds, Rebecca wondered what circumstances had brought a Lakota chief, alone and injured, to her doorstep. The prevailing wisdom was that the Lakota people stayed with their tribes, especially in winter when survival depended on community. Night fell, and Rebecca settled into the rocking chair beside the bed, prepared for a vigil. She dozed fitfully, waking often to check on her unexpected patient, replacing the cool cloths on his forehead as fever set in during the darkest hours. It was near dawn when he first showed signs of true consciousness. Rebecca had just added wood to the fire when a movement from the bed caught her attention. The Lakota chief was awake, his dark eyes alert and focused intently on her. For a long moment, they simply stared at each other, the crackling fire the only sound in the small cabin. Rebecca felt a flutter of fear, suddenly acutely aware of her vulnerability. She was alone with a stranger, a man from a culture she knew little about beyond newspaper accounts that painted his people as savages, but something in his gaze held no threat, only a wary assessment that matched her own. "Water," she said slowly, pointing to a cup beside the bed. "You need to drink." To her surprise, he nodded slightly, wincing at the movement. When she helped him raise his head to drink, he accepted her assistance without resistance, though she could sense the pride it cost him to rely on her help. After drinking deeply, He settled back against the pillows and spoke, his voice deep and rough from disuse. "Wazia," he said, gesturing toward the window where snow had begun to fall again. Then, to Rebecca's astonishment, he continued in halting but clear English. "Cold spirit brings the winter." Rebecca stared at him, momentarily speechless. "You speak English," she finally managed. A flicker of something, perhaps amusement, crossed his face, despite his obvious pain. "Some," he confirmed, "learned from the traders, from the missionaries." He studied her face with the same intensity she'd felt earlier. "You helped me," he stated. Not a question, but an acknowledgement. "Yes," Rebecca replied simply. "Why?" The single word carried the weight of generations of mistrust, of boundaries crossed and treaties broken. Rebecca considered the question seriously, knowing instinctively that a trite or insincere answer would not satisfy this man. "Because you needed help," she finally said, "and I could give it. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story." The Lakota chief regarded Rebecca with careful consideration, his dark eyes revealing nothing of his thoughts. After a long moment, he nodded once, as if accepting her simple explanation. "I am Maka," he said, touching his chest lightly. "It means earth in your tongue." "Rebecca Mitchell," she replied, offering her own name. In return, Maka attempted to shift position and immediately grimaced, his hand moving instinctively to the wound in his side. Rebecca moved quickly to check the bandages, relieved to find that while blood had seeped through, the bleeding hadn't worsened significantly. "You must stay still," she instructed firmly. "The stitches will tear if you move too much." He settled. Back, his breathing labored. "How long?" he asked. "You've been here since yesterday afternoon," Rebecca answered, understanding his question. "You collapsed at my door during the brief break in the storm." Maka's gaze moved to the window where snow continued to fall heavily. "Bad medicine," he murmured. "Winter comes early this year. Angry spirits." Rebecca busied herself preparing a thin broth from her dwindling supplies. "What happened to you?" she finally asked, her back to him as she worked. "How did you come to be injured and alone?" The silence stretched so long that she thought he might have fallen asleep or perhaps chosen not to answer. When his voice came, it was measured, each word carefully chosen. "Soldiers attacked our hunting party 3 days ago, without warning, without cause. We were on our own lands, following the buffalo." His voice hardened slightly. "The treaty means nothing to them." Rebecca turned to face him, the broth forgotten. The Fort Laramie Treaty had been signed years ago, establishing boundaries for the Lakota territories. But rumors had circulated among settlers that gold had been discovered in the Black Hills, sacred Lakota land. Such discoveries had a way of making treaties suddenly flexible in the eyes of the government. "We scattered," Maka continued. "2 of my brothers fell. I led the soldiers away from our people." A hint of pride entered his voice. "They followed me for 2 days before I lost them, but not before this." He gestured to his shoulder where the bullet had passed through. "And your side?" Rebecca asked, returning to the bedside with the broth. "A wolf," he said simply. "Hungry, like all creatures this winter. I killed it, but not before it marked me." The matter-of-fact way he described surviving both a military pursuit and a wolf attack spoke volumes about the life he led. Rebecca helped him sit up enough to drink the broth, noting how he accepted her assistance with dignity despite what must have been considerable pain. "My people will search for me when they can," Maka said after finishing the broth. "But the storm—" He gazed out the window again, his expression unreadable. Rebecca understood the unspoken reality. In such weather, no one would be searching and no one would find them. They were effectively isolated together until conditions improved. "Then you will stay until you heal," she said, with more confidence than she felt. In truth, her supplies were barely sufficient for one person, let alone two. But she couldn't turn him out into the storm, especially in his condition. Maka seemed to read her thoughts. "I take little," he assured her, "and when I can move, I will hunt." The next 2 days fell into an uneasy routine. Rebecca tended Maka's wounds, which thankfully showed signs of healing rather than worsening infection. Despite his stoic demeanor, she could tell he was in considerable pain, though he rarely complained. She made poultices from the herbs she had dried last autumn, following her mother's recipes for drawing out infection and easing inflammation. For his part, Maka watched her with curious eyes as she moved about the cabin, attending to the daily tasks that kept them alive, stoking the fire, melting snow for water, preparing their meager meals. On the second evening, when she took out her journal to record the day's events, as had been her habit since arriving in the territory, he asked her about it. "You make marks on paper," he observed, "like the treaty makers." Rebecca smiled slightly. "I'm writing in my journal, recording what happens each day." "Why?" The question was genuine, not challenging. She considered how to explain something that had always been part of her life. "To remember," she finally said, "and perhaps so others will know we were here if—" She trailed off, not wanting to voice the possibility that had loomed larger with each passing day before his arrival, that she might not survive until spring. "Your people value the written word," Maka observed. "My people remember through stories, passed from elders to children." "Will you tell me one?" Rebecca asked, genuinely curious. "A story of your people?" Something shifted in Maka's expression, surprise perhaps at her interest. After a moment he began speaking, his deep voice filling the small cabin with tales of Iktomi, the trickster spider, of the creation of the Black Hills that the Lakota called Paha Sapa, and of the great white buffalo calf woman who brought the sacred pipe to the Lakota people. Rebecca listened, entranced as the stories unfolded, complex narratives of morality, history, and spirituality, woven together in ways that reminded her of the Bible stories from her childhood, yet were entirely different in their perspective and meaning. When Maka finally fell silent, exhausted by the effort of speaking at length, Rebecca realized hours had passed. The storm outside had intensified, the wind screaming around the cabin like a living thing. "Thank you," she said softly, "for sharing your stories." Maka nodded, his eyes heavy with approaching sleep. "Tomorrow," he murmured, "you will tell me your stories." The following morning brought a break in the storm, though the sky remained threateningly grey. Rebecca opened the cabin door briefly to collect fresh snow for melting, and was struck by the absolute stillness of the world outside, a blanket of white stretching as far as she could see, broken only by the dark shapes of distant trees. When she turned back inside, she found Maka, attempting to sit up on his own. His face was drawn with pain, but determination showed in every line of his body. "You shouldn't be moving yet," she protested, hurrying to his side. "Must regain strength," he countered, his breathing labored. "Cannot remain weak. My people need their chief." Rebecca helped him settle into a seated position, propped against the wall. "Your people would rather have their chief alive and fully healed than dead from stubbornness," she said firmly. To her surprise, Maka laughed, a short, rough sound, as if unused to the action. "You speak boldly for a woman alone in the wilderness." "Bold. Speech is sometimes all I have," Rebecca admitted, busying herself with adding wood to the fire. "Not all," Maka disagreed. "You have courage and kindness." He paused, studying her with that intense gaze that seemed to see more than she intended. "So, why are you here, Rebecca Mitchell? This is no place for a woman alone." The direct question caught her off guard. For months, she had avoided examining her own situation too closely, focusing instead on the daily battle for survival. "My husband brought us here," she finally said, settling into the chair opposite him. Thomas believed the West offered opportunities we couldn't find in Philadelphia. A chance to build something of our own. She gestured around the modest cabin. We arrived in spring. By autumn, we had this shelter and plans for expanding in the spring. Then winter came early, and Thomas... Her voice caught. Pneumonia took him in 3 days. Why did you not return to your people when he died? Maka asked. No judgment in his tone, only curiosity. Rebecca had asked herself the same question many times during the long, lonely nights. Stubbornness, perhaps, she admitted, or pride. I had nothing to return to in Philadelphia. My parents are dead and I have no siblings, and the journey would be dangerous for a woman alone. She met his gaze steadily. This land was our dream. Leaving felt like admitting defeat. Maka nodded slowly, understanding in his eyes. To abandon the land is to abandon the dream. He said, This I understand. My people have lived in these hills for generations beyond counting. They are sacred to us, filled with the spirits of our ancestors. To leave them would be to lose ourselves. The parallel between their situations wasn't lost on Rebecca, despite the vast differences in their backgrounds and circumstances. Both were fighting to hold on to something precious, something central to their identity. Throughout the day, as Maka's strength slowly returned, they continued to exchange stories, Rebecca speaking of her life in Philadelphia, of books she had read and places she had seen, while Maka described the seasonal movements of his people, following game and preparing for the harsh winters, ceremonies that marked the passages of life and the wisdom of elders that guided the tribe's decisions. By evening, Rebecca realized she had spoken more words in a single day than in the entire 3 months since Thomas's death. The isolation had affected her more deeply than she had admitted, even to herself. Having another human presence, even one from a vastly different world than her own, awakened something that had been slowly dying inside her. As night fell and the temperature dropped precipitously, Rebecca realized their wood supply was running dangerously low. She had been conservative with its use, but having 2 people in the cabin required more heat than she had planned for. If the storm continued, they would face a difficult choice within days: venture out to cut more or risk freezing in the cabin. She didn't voice these concerns to Maka, but as she made her nightly notation in her journal before sleeping, she caught him watching her with knowing eyes. Tomorrow, he said quietly, if the storm holds its breath, I will help gather wood. Your wounds, she began to protest, will heal, he finished firmly, but not if we freeze. He shifted slightly, wincing at the movement. I have survived worse, Rebecca Mitchell, and I will not be a burden to one who saved my life. As Rebecca settled onto her makeshift bed of blankets near the fire, having insisted that Maka continue to use the bed until his wounds healed further, she reflected on the strange turn her life had taken. A week ago, she had been alone, her hopes dwindling with her supplies. Now she shared her small cabin with a Lakota chief, exchanging stories and planning for tomorrow. The future remained uncertain, fraught with dangers both immediate and potential. But for the first time since Thomas's death, Rebecca felt something beside grim determination, a small spark of connection that made survival seem not just necessary, but worthwhile. Morning arrived with unexpected brightness, sunlight reflecting off the snow with blinding intensity. Rebecca woke to find Maka already awake, sitting at the edge of the bed, testing his strength by carefully stretching his uninjured arm. The storm has passed, he noted as she stirred. For now. Rebecca moved to the window, brushing aside the old frost that had formed overnight. The landscape sparkled pristinely under a clear blue sky, deceptively beautiful despite the deadly cold it concealed. We should gather wood while we can, she agreed, turning back to Maka, but you shouldn't strain your wounds. Maka rose slowly to his feet, steadying himself against the wall. His face betrayed no pain, though Rebecca knew the effort must cost him greatly. "I will show you how to find deadfall beneath the snow," he said. "Good wood, already dry." Rebecca knew better than to argue with the determination she saw in his eyes. Instead, she prepared a hasty breakfast of cornmeal mush, one of the few supplies she still had in relative abundance, and helped Maka dress in a combination of his own buckskin leggings and one of Thomas's old shirts, which hung loosely on his frame despite his height and breadth of shoulder. When they ventured outside, the cold hit with physical force, stealing the breath from Rebecca's lungs. Maka seemed less affected, his face turned to the sun, as if drawing strength from its weak winter light. "This way," he directed, pointing toward a stand of trees about 100 yards from the cabin. He moved slowly but steadily, his natural grace hampered by his injuries, yet still evident in his careful steps across the snow. At the tree line, Maka demonstrated how to locate fallen branches beneath the snow by the subtle variations in the surface. "The snow sits differently on wood than on earth," he explained, pointing to a barely perceptible ridge in the otherwise smooth expanse. Using a sturdy stick as both a probe and a support for himself, he uncovered a substantial branch, perfectly seasoned by time and protected from the worst moisture by the snow itself. Rebecca followed his example, and soon they had uncovered a surprisingly large cache of usable firewood. Maka fashioned a crude sledge from branches and some rope Rebecca had brought, allowing them to transport more wood than they could have carried by hand. As they worked, Rebecca found herself studying Maka when he wasn't looking. The measured way he moved, the quiet dignity he maintained despite his weakened state, the occasional flash of pain that crossed his features when he thought she wasn't watching. In just a few days, this man had transformed from a feared savage into a complex individual with his own story, his own struggles, and his own kind of wisdom. "You look at me with many questions in your eyes," Maka observed, catching her gaze. As they loaded the last of their gathered wood onto the sledge, Rebecca flushed slightly, embarrassed at being so transparent. "I was just thinking how different you are from what I expected," she admitted. A hint of amusement touched Maka's lips. "And what did you expect of a Lakota chief?" She considered the question honestly. "The newspapers and dime novels paint your people as—" She hesitated, not wanting to offend. "As bloodthirsty savages," Maka finished for her, no anger in his tone, merely resignation. "And your people are painted to us as greedy trespassers who break every promise." He looked out across the snow-covered landscape. "There is truth and falsehood in both pictures." They began the slow journey back to the cabin, Maka pulling the sledge, despite Rebecca's protests. The exertion had clearly taxed his strength, but she recognized his need to contribute, to maintain his dignity despite his dependence on her care. "Your husband," Maka said as they neared the cabin, breaking the comfortable silence that had fallen between them. "He chose good land, near water, protected from the north wind, with trees nearby for building and fuel." Rebecca glanced at him, surprised by this assessment. "Thomas spent weeks scouting before choosing this spot. He said it had everything we needed to thrive." Maka nodded. "He saw with clear eyes, this is good land." A shadow passed over his face. "It was Lakota hunting ground many seasons ago, before the treaties pushed us further west." The simple statement hung in the air between them, a reminder of the larger forces that shaped their individual lives, the complex history that had ultimately brought them together in this isolated moment. Back inside the cabin, Rebecca insisted that Maka rest while she stacked the wood and prepared a more substantial meal from their limited stores. The morning's exertion had reopened his shoulder wound slightly, requiring fresh bandages and another application of her dwindling supply of medicinal herbs. As she worked, Maka watched her with thoughtful eyes. "You have healing hands," he observed. "Among my people you would be respected for this gift." Rebecca smiled slightly. "It's not a gift, merely knowledge passed from my mother. She served as a nurse during the war, what you would call the white man's civil war." "All knowledge is a gift," Maka countered, "whether from spirits or from those who came before us." He winced slightly as she tightened the bandage. "My people have healers too, medicine men and women who know the plants that cure, the songs that call the healing spirits." "I would like to learn such things," Rebecca said, securing the bandage in place. "The settlers' medicines are often limited, and we're far from doctors out here." Maka studied her face, as if assessing her sincerity. After a moment, he began to speak, describing plants that could be found even in winter if one knew where to look. Bark that could ease pain, roots that reduced fever, berries that provided strength during illness. Rebecca listened intently, committing the descriptions to memory, recognizing the value of such knowledge in her isolated existence. As evening approached, Rebecca found herself dreading the coming darkness less than she had in months. The cabin, which had felt like a lonely prison since Thomas's death, now felt almost companionable with Maka's presence. Their day's work had exhausted them both, and conversation dwindled as they ate their simple supper of stewed dried meat and the last of the cornmeal. "Tomorrow I will try to hunt," Maka announced, as Rebecca cleared away their meager meal. "Small game may be found even in this season." Rebecca frowned. "You're not strong enough yet." "I am stronger than hunger," he replied simply. "Your supplies grow thin. I see how you take less food than you give me." She hadn't realized he'd noticed her careful rationing, her tendency to give him the larger portion while claiming she wasn't hungry. His perception was keen, despite his weakened state. "We have enough for a few more days," she argued. Maka shook his head. "A wise hunter does not wait until the last meal is eaten before seeking more, and I have been too long dependent on your kindness." The stubborn set of his jaw told Rebecca that further argument would be futile. Instead, she retrieved Thomas's hunting knife from a small chest in the corner of the cabin. "At least take this," she said, offering it to him. "It's good steel." Maka accepted the knife with appropriate solemnity, recognizing it as both a practical tool and a gesture of trust. He tested the edge with his thumb and nodded approval. "Your husband kept it sharp. A dull blade is more dangerous than none." As night settled around the cabin, Rebecca made her customary entry in her journal, recording the day's activities and her observations about their wood-gathering expedition. She found herself writing more than usual, noting details of Maka's knowledge about finding deadfall in winter and the medicinal plants he had described. In recording these things, she was preserving not just the events of the day, but the wisdom he had shared, knowledge that might one day be the difference between survival and death in this unforgiving land. When she finished writing, she found Maka watching her with curious intensity. "What do you write of this day?" he asked. Rather than simply answering, Rebecca moved to sit beside him and held the journal so he could see, even though she knew he couldn't read the words. "I wrote about finding the wood beneath the snow, and about the healing plants you described, so I won't forget." Maka studied the neat rows of handwriting. "Your marks cannot capture a voice or a face," he observed. "How do you remember these things?" "We don't. Not perfectly," Rebecca admitted. "Words can describe, but they cannot truly replace the experience itself. This is why my people tell stories around the fire," Maka explained. "The voice, the faces of those listening, the flames dancing, all are part of the memory, part of the learning." Rebecca considered this perspective. Perhaps both ways have value. The written word preserves exactly what was said, but your way preserves how it felt to hear it. Maka seemed pleased with this assessment. Two paths to the same mountaintop, he said with a slight nod, both showing different views of the same truth. As they prepared for sleep, a comfortable silence settled between them, two people from vastly different worlds finding unexpected common ground in the shared struggle for survival. Outside, the temperature dropped precipitously, stars glittering like shards of ice in the black sky. But inside the small cabin, the fire burned steadily, fed by their morning's labor, a small victory against the encroaching winter. Rebecca lay awake longer than usual, listening to Maka's deep, even breathing from the bed across the room. In just a few days, this stranger had transformed her isolated existence, bringing not just an extra pair of hands for necessary tasks, but a different perspective on the world she inhabited. She had spent months viewing her situation solely through the lens of loss and hardship. Maka, despite his injuries and the dangers he faced, seemed to approach each day as a gift, each challenge as an opportunity to demonstrate strength and wisdom. As sleep finally claimed her, Rebecca wondered how her life might have been different if settlers and natives had found more such moments of connection and understanding, rather than the suspicion and conflict that had characterized their interactions for generations. It was a question without an answer, but for the first time since Thomas's death, she fell asleep thinking of possibilities rather than merely survival. Dawn broke with a gunmetal sky that promised more snow before nightfall. Rebecca woke to find Maka already dressed in his buckskin clothing, supplemented with a wool scarf she had insisted he take to protect his healing wounds from the bitter cold. "You truly mean to hunt today," she observed, noting the determined set of his jaw. Maka nodded, securing Thomas's hunting knife at his belt. "The weather will turn again by midday. Small game will be moving now, seeking food before the next storm." He gestured to a collection of slender branches he had fashioned into crude but effective snares. "I will set these in likely places. With patience and good fortune, they will provide." Rebecca wanted to protest that he was still too weak for such exertion, but she knew their situation was growing dire. Her carefully rationed supplies would last perhaps 3 more days at best, and the new storm brewing on the horizon might trap them for longer. "Take this," she said instead, retrieving a small leather pouch from a shelf. "It's jerky, the last of it. You'll need strength." Maka accepted the offering with a nod of thanks. He moved with greater ease than the day before, though Rebecca could still see the careful way he held himself to avoid straining his wounded side. "I won't go far," he assured her, sensing her concern. "The best hunting will be near the creek where the brush provides shelter for rabbits and grouse." "Be careful," Rebecca said, trying to keep the worry from her voice. "The temperature drops quickly when clouds move in." A ghost of a smile touched Maka's lips. "I have survived many winters, Rebecca Mitchell, but your concern honors me." With that he slipped out into the cold morning, moving with the silent grace that seemed natural to him, despite his injuries. Rebecca watched through the window until his figure disappeared among the trees, then set about her own tasks with an efficiency born of months of solitary routine. She melted snow for water, checked their wood supply, and took inventory of their remaining food, activities that filled time but couldn't distract her from the growing worry that gnawed at her consciousness. The rational part of her mind recognized that Maka was far more capable in this wilderness than she was, wounded or not, but another part feared that his departure might prove permanent, that he might decide his debt to her was paid and continue on to find his people once his strength returned. The thought of returning to complete solitude after these days of companionship and shared knowledge left an unexpected hollow feeling in her chest. By midday, the clouds had thickened as Maka predicted, and fine snow began to sift down from the leaden sky. Rebecca found herself checking the window with increasing frequency, straining to see through the curtain of falling snow for any sign of his return. When the cabin door finally swung open in the early afternoon, she couldn't contain her relief. Maka entered with a blast of cold air, snow dusting his shoulders and hair. More importantly, 3 rabbits hung from a cord at his belt. "You were successful," Rebecca said, unable to keep the admiration from her voice. "The spirits were generous," Maka replied, though pride glinted in his dark eyes. He laid the rabbits on the table and carefully removed his outer garments, moving with more stiffness than when he had departed. The hunt had clearly taxed his healing body. "Let me check your wounds," Rebecca insisted, noting how he favored his injured side. Maka allowed her to examine the bandages, which showed spots of fresh blood where his exertion had strained the healing tissues. As she applied fresh herbs and clean cloths, he described his morning's activities, how he had set snares in the brush along the creek bank, found tracks in the fresh snow, and waited with the patience of a lifetime hunter for his quarry to appear. "I saw signs of larger game as well," he added, as Rebecca finished rebandaging his shoulder. "Deer have moved down from the high country, seeking shelter from the storms. When my strength returns fully, we might have venison to smoke for the remaining winter months." The casual "we" in his statement caught Rebecca's attention. It suggested he planned to remain longer than just these immediate days of recovery, a thought that brought unexpected comfort. Together, they skinned and prepared the rabbits, Maka demonstrating how to preserve every usable part. The meat would provide several meals. The fur could be cured for warmth. Even the bones could be used for tools or boiled for the rich marrow they contained. Rebecca had learned some of these skills from Thomas, but Maka's knowledge was deeper, more instinctive, the accumulated wisdom of generations who had survived in this harsh landscape long before settlers arrived. As they worked, the snow intensified. Outside, driven by an increasingly bitter wind that found every crack in the cabin's walls. By the time they had finished preparing a stew with one of the rabbits and some of Rebecca's precious store of dried vegetables, visibility had dropped to mere feet beyond the windows. "The winter spirit is angry today," Maka observed as they ate the first truly satisfying meal either had enjoyed in days. "It is good we gathered wood yesterday, and that you hunted this morning," Rebecca added. "Your timing was fortunate." Maka shook his head slightly. "Not fortune, reading the signs. The clouds, the way the birds flew, the smell of the air, all told of the coming storm." He studied her face across the table. "These are things you must learn if you are to survive here alone." The practical truth of his statement struck Rebecca forcefully. Despite her determination to maintain the homestead after Thomas's death, her knowledge of the land and its patterns remained dangerously limited. Her husband had possessed some of this wilderness wisdom, but much had died with him, leaving her vulnerable in ways she was only now fully comprehending. "Will you teach me?" she asked simply. Maka considered her request with appropriate seriousness. "Some knowledge comes only with seasons of observation," he finally said. "But yes, I will teach what can be taught in words and demonstration." As the storm howled outside, transforming the world into a swirling chaos of white, they sat before the fire in a companionable silence that gradually gave way to conversation. Maka began by describing the patterns of weather in the Dakota Territory, how to recognize the signs of an approaching blizzard, the particular quality of light that preceded a thaw, the behaviors of animals that indicated changing seasons. Rebecca listened intently, occasionally making notes in her journal when Maka shared particularly crucial information. The practical exchange gradually shifted to more personal terrain as the evening deepened. You said you had no family remaining in the East, Maka remarked. No children from your union with Thomas? Rebecca shook her head, a familiar pang of sorrow touching her heart. We hoped for children once we were properly established here. Now, she left the thought unfinished, the loss of that future too complex to articulate. Children are the heartbeat of my people, Maka said softly. Each one belongs not just to parents, but to the entire tribe, taught by all, protected by all. "Do you have children?" Rebecca asked, realizing how little she knew of his personal life beyond his status as a chief. A shadow crossed Maka's face. "I had a son and a wife." The past tense spoke volumes. "I'm sorry," Rebecca said, recognizing the grief that flickered momentarily in his usually stoic expression. Maka stared into the fire, his thoughts clearly traveling to places and times beyond the confines of the small cabin. 3 winters ago, sickness came to our village," he finally continued. "A disease brought by traders. Many died, including Wachiwi, my wife, and Chetan, our son." The simple statement, delivered without self-pity, held a depth of loss that Rebecca understood all too well. "That's why you weren't afraid of catching typhoid from Thomas," she realized aloud. "You'd already survived something similar." Maka nodded. "The fever that took your husband took many of my people as well. Those who survive such sickness carry protection against it afterward." His expression grew distant. "My son would have been 7 winters old now, beginning his training as a hunter." Rebecca found herself reaching across the space between them, her hand resting lightly on Maka's forearm, a gesture of shared understanding that transcended their cultural differences. For a moment, they were simply 2 people who had endured profound loss, who recognized in each other the particular shape of that emptiness. Maka covered her hand briefly with his own, the unexpected warmth of human contact, momentarily overwhelming for both of them after so much isolation. Then he withdrew, the moment passing as naturally as it had arisen. "The storm will continue through the night," he said, his tone shifting back to practical matters. "Tomorrow we should check the roof. The snow will be heavy." Rebecca nodded, accepting the change in subject. "Thomas reinforced it before he fell ill, but it hasn't faced a storm this severe." "We will examine it when light returns," Maka assured her. "For now, rest is wise." As they prepared for sleep, Rebecca on her pallet near the fire, Maka on the bed she still insisted he use while healing. The howling wind outside only emphasized the cocoon of relative safety they had created within the cabin's walls. 2 people from worlds that had been in conflict for generations, now dependent on each other for survival against a common, implacable enemy, the merciless Dakota winter. Rebecca lay awake long after Maka's breathing had settled into the rhythm of sleep, reflecting on how quickly circumstances could transform a stranger into an ally, how shared hardship could bridge divides that had seemed insurmountable. In the flickering firelight, she studied his profile. Strong features relaxed in sleep, the ceremonial scar on his cheekbone that she now knew marked him as a proven warrior among his people, the grey beginning to thread through his dark hair. Despite his relatively young age, a week ago, the sight of such a man approaching her cabin would have filled her with terror. Now his presence brought security, knowledge, and a connection to something beyond mere survival. As sleep finally claimed her, Rebecca wondered what Thomas would make of the situation if he could somehow observe from whatever realm lay beyond. This one. Would he understand the alliance she had formed with Maka? Or would he, like so many settlers, see only danger in this cultural crossing? Such questions had no answers. But as the storm raged outside and the fire burned low, Rebecca found herself grateful for the twist of fate that had brought Maka to her door. Wounded, but bearing gifts she hadn't known she needed, practical knowledge of this harsh land and the simple human connection that made enduring it worthwhile. Morning arrived with an eerie silence that told Rebecca the storm had passed, at least temporarily. She rose to find Maka already awake, stoking the fire with careful movements that suggested his wounds still pained him despite his efforts to conceal it. "The snow has stopped," he noted, glancing toward the frost-covered window, "but the cold remains." Rebecca moved to the window, rubbing away the ice crystals to peer outside. The world had been transformed overnight, familiar landmarks buried beneath drifts that in some places reached halfway up the cabin walls. The weight of the snow pressed against the structure, making the timbers creak ominously. "We need to clear some of this away from the walls," she said, assessing the situation with growing concern. "And check the roof, as you suggested." Maka nodded, coming to stand beside her at the window. "The door may be difficult to open." He was right. When they tried, the accumulated snow formed a barricade that required both of them pushing with all their strength to break through. The cold that rushed in stole Rebecca's breath away, sharper, more intense than before the storm, with a stillness that spoke of dangerously low temperatures. They worked methodically to clear pathways around the cabin, Maka insisting on taking the heavier labor despite Rebecca's protests about his injuries. His determination was evident in every line of his body, and Rebecca gradually understood that for him, contributing to their survival was not just practical necessity, but a matter of honor and identity. "In my culture," he explained as they paused, to catch their breath, "a chief provides for his people, leads by example, shows strength even when wounded." He gestured to the work they had accomplished. To do less would dishonor the position. Rebecca considered this perspective, even when there are no other Lakota to witness it. "The witness is here," Maka replied, touching his chest, "and the spirits watch always." After clearing enough snow to relieve the pressure on the cabin walls, Maka fashioned a crude ladder from logs and rope that allowed him to access the roof. Rebecca hovered anxiously below as he carefully removed the heaviest snow accumulation from the center, where the weight threatened the structural integrity of the beams beneath. By midday, the most crucial work was complete, though both were exhausted from the exertion in the bitter cold. Inside the cabin once more, Rebecca prepared a meal from one of the rabbits Maka had caught, adding the last of her preserved carrots to create a hearty stew. As they ate, Maka gazed thoughtfully into the fire. "This storm has changed things," he said after a long silence. Rebecca looked up from her bowl, feeling a sudden apprehension. "What do you mean?" "The snow is too deep now for easy travel. The cold too intense." He met her eyes directly. "My people will have made their winter camp in the sheltered valley to the west, where the pines break the wind and game can still be found. But reaching them now would be—" He paused. "Dangerous," Rebecca supplied. "Yes." The admission seemed to cost him something. In full strength with proper supplies, it would be difficult but possible. In my current condition, the implication hung in the air between them. Maka would be staying, not just for days, but potentially weeks, until either his strength fully returned or the weather moderated enough to make travel less perilous. The practical truth of his statement struck Rebecca forcefully. Despite her determination to maintain the homestead after Thomas's death, her knowledge of the land and its patterns remained dangerously limited. Her husband had possessed some of this wilderness wisdom, but much had died with him, leaving her vulnerable in ways she was only now fully comprehending. "Will you teach me?" she asked simply. Maka considered her request with appropriate seriousness. "Some knowledge comes only with seasons of observation," he finally said. "But yes, I will teach what can be taught in words and demonstration, as The storm howled outside, transforming the world into a swirling chaos of white. They sat before the fire in a companionable silence that gradually gave way to conversation. Mika began by describing the patterns of weather in the Dakota Territory, how to recognize the signs of an approaching blizzard, the particular quality of light that preceded a thaw, the behaviors of animals that indicated changing seasons. Rebecca listened intently, occasionally making notes in her journal when Maka shared particularly crucial information. The practical exchange gradually shifted to more personal terrain as the evening deepened. "You said you had no family remaining in the East," Maka remarked. "No children from your union with Thomas." Rebecca shook her head, a familiar pang of sorrow touching her heart. "We hoped for children once we were properly established here. Now," she left the thought unfinished, the loss of that future too complex to articulate. "Children are the heartbeat of my people," Maka said softly. "Each one belongs not just to parents, but to the entire tribe, taught by all, protected by all." "Do you have children?" Rebecca asked, realizing how little she knew of his personal life beyond his status as a chief. A shadow crossed Maka's face. "I had a son and a wife." The past tense spoke volumes. "I'm sorry," Rebecca said, recognizing the grief that flickered momentarily in his usually stoic expression. Maka stared into the fire, his thoughts clearly traveling to places and times beyond the confines of the small cabin. "3 winters ago, sickness came to our village," he finally continued. "A disease brought by traders. Many died, including Wachiwi, my wife, and Chetan, our son." The simple statement, delivered without self-pity, held a depth of loss that Rebecca understood all too well. "That's why you weren't afraid of catching typhoid from Thomas," she realized aloud. "You'd already survived something similar." Maka nodded. "The fever that took your husband took many of my people as well. Those who survive such sickness carry protection against it afterward." His expression grew distant. "My son would have been 7 winters old now, beginning his training as a hunter." Rebecca found herself reaching across the space between them, her hand resting lightly on Maka's forearm, a gesture of shared understanding that transcended their cultural differences. For a moment, they were simply 2 people who had endured profound loss, who recognized in each other the particular shape of that emptiness. Maka covered her hand briefly with his own, the unexpected warmth of human contact momentarily overwhelming for both of them after so much isolation. Then he withdrew, the moment passing as naturally as it had arisen. "The storm will continue through the night," he said, his tone shifting back to practical matters. "Tomorrow we should check the roof. The snow will be heavy." Rebecca nodded, accepting the change in subject. "Thomas reinforced it before he fell ill, but it hasn't faced a storm this severe." "We will examine it when light returns," Maka assured her. "For now, rest is wise." As they prepared for sleep, Rebecca on her pallet near the fire, Maka on the bed she still insisted he use while healing, the howling wind outside only emphasized the cocoon of relative safety they had created within the cabin's walls. 2 people from worlds that had been in conflict for generations, now dependent on each other for survival against a common, implacable enemy, the merciless Dakota winter. Rebecca lay awake long after Maka's breathing had settled into the rhythm of sleep, reflecting on how quickly circumstances could transform a stranger into an ally, how shared hardship could bridge divides that had seemed insurmountable. In the flickering firelight, she studied his profile, strong features relaxed in sleep, the ceremonial scar on his cheekbone that she now knew marked him as a proven warrior among his people, the grey beginning to thread through his dark hair. Despite his relatively young age, A week ago, the sight of such a man approaching her cabin would have filled her with terror. Now his presence brought security, knowledge, and a connection to something beyond mere survival. As sleep finally claimed her, Rebecca wondered what Thomas would make of the situation if he could somehow observe from whatever realm lay beyond. This one. Would he understand the alliance she had formed with Maka, or would he, like so many settlers, see only danger in this cultural crossing? Such questions had no answers. But as the storm raged outside and the fire burned low, Rebecca found herself grateful for the twist of fate that had brought Maka to her door. Wounded, but bearing gifts she hadn't known she needed, practical knowledge of this harsh land, and the simple human connection that made enduring it worthwhile. Morning arrived with an eerie silence that told Rebecca the storm had passed, at least temporarily. She rose to find Maka already awake, stoking the fire with careful movements that suggested his wounds still pained him despite his efforts to conceal it. "The snow has stopped," he noted, glancing toward the frost-covered window. "But the cold remains." Rebecca moved to the window, rubbing away the ice crystals to peer outside. The world had been transformed overnight, familiar landmarks buried beneath drifts that in some places reached halfway up the cabin walls. The weight of the snow pressed against the structure, making the timbers creak ominously. "We need to clear some of this away from the walls," she said, assessing the situation with growing concern. "And check the roof as you suggested." Maka nodded, coming to stand beside her at the window. "The door may be difficult to open." He was right. When they tried, the accumulated snow formed a barricade that required both of them pushing with all their strength to break through. The cold that rushed in stole Rebecca's breath away, sharper, more intense than before the storm, with a stillness that spoke of dangerously low temperatures. They worked methodically to clear pathways around the cabin, Maka insisting on taking the heavier labor despite Rebecca's protests about his injuries. His determination was evident in every line of his body, and Rebecca gradually understood that for him, contributing to their survival was not just practical necessity, but a matter of honor and identity. "In my culture," he explained as they paused, "to catch their breath, a chief provides for his people, leads by example, shows strength even when wounded." He gestured to the work they had accomplished. To do less would dishonor the position. Rebecca considered this perspective, even when there are no other Lakota to witness it. "The witness is here," Maka replied, touching his chest, "and the spirits watch always." After clearing enough snow to relieve the pressure on the cabin walls, Maka fashioned a crude ladder from logs and rope that allowed him to access the roof. Rebecca hovered anxiously below as he carefully removed the heaviest snow accumulation from the center, where the weight threatened the structural integrity of the beams beneath. By midday, the most crucial work was complete, though both were exhausted from the exertion in the bitter cold. Inside the cabin once more, Rebecca prepared a meal from one of the rabbits Maka had caught, adding the last of her preserved carrots to create a hearty stew. As they ate, Maka gazed thoughtfully into the fire. "This storm has changed things," he said, after a long silence. Rebecca looked up from her bowl, feeling a sudden apprehension. "What do you mean?" "The snow is too deep now for easy travel. The cold too intense." He met her eyes directly. "My people will have made their winter camp in the sheltered valley to the west, where the pines break the wind and game can still be found. But reaching them now would be—" He paused. "Dangerous," Rebecca supplied. "Yes." The admission seemed to cost him something. "In full strength, with proper supplies, it would be difficult but possible. In my current condition—" The implication hung in the air between them. Maka would be staying, not just for days, but potentially weeks, until either his strength fully returned or the weather moderated enough to make travel less perilous. "Then we face the winter together," Rebecca said simply, surprising herself with how naturally the words came. Maka studied her face, perhaps searching for hesitation or reluctance. Finding none, he gave a single decisive nod. Together, he agreed. But we must prepare more thoroughly. The rabbits will help, but we need larger game to smoke and preserve. My people cache food for the harshest months. We should do the same. There's a shed behind the cabin, Rebecca offered. Thomas planned to smoke meat there, though we hadn't finished preparing it before. She trailed off. Show me, Maka requested. After their meal, Rebecca led him through the snow to the small structure at the rear of the cabin, little more than a lean-to with a dirt floor and rough plank walls. Maka examined it with a critical eye, noting the gaps in the planking and the unfinished smoking rack Thomas had begun constructing. This can be made useful, he determined, with work and proper sealing against the cold. If I can hunt deer, we could preserve enough meat to last many weeks. The practical discussion of preparations gave Rebecca an unexpected sense of security. After months of simply reacting to immediate needs, barely staying ahead of starvation and freezing, the idea of planning beyond the next day felt almost luxurious. They spent the remainder of the daylight hours gathering more firewood from the deadfall Maka had located, Rebecca now able to spot the subtle signs he had taught her, the slight ridges in the snow, the different way light reflected off surfaces with solid objects beneath. As dusk approached, bringing with it a renewed drop in temperature, they returned to the cabin with their bounty. The physical labor had clearly taxed Maka's healing body, though he made no complaint. When Rebecca insisted on checking his wounds, she found the shoulder healing cleanly, but the gash on his side showed signs of strain, the edges reddened from the day's exertion. "You've done too much," she chided gently, applying fresh herbs to the inflamed area. "Necessary work," Maka countered, though he submitted to her ministrations without resistance. "Winter waits for no man's healing." As she worked, Rebecca found herself acutely aware of their unusual situation, the cultural boundaries they had crossed, the intimacy of tending to his wounds, the growing ease between them that would have been unthinkable weeks ago. In Philadelphia, even the suggestion of such proximity to a man, not her husband, would have scandalized proper society. Here, in the isolated reality of survival, such concerns seemed trivial compared to the genuine need for human connection and mutual aid. "You're thinking deeply," Maka observed, reading her expression with that uncanny perception she had come to expect from him. Rebecca secured the fresh bandage before answering. "I was thinking how different the rules are here compared to the world I came from. How much of what I was taught to value seems meaningless in the face of survival." Maka nodded thoughtfully. "The white man's world has many rules that puzzle my people. Rules about who may speak to whom may touch, who holds value." He gestured to the cabin around them. "But in the winter, when the cold seeks to claim all life, the only rule that matters is the one that preserves the flame." The simple wisdom of this statement struck Rebecca forcefully. She had been raised with rigid notions of propriety, class, and social standing, none of which had any relevance in her current circumstances. What mattered now was keeping the fire burning, finding food, supporting one another through the harsh reality of the Dakota winter. "Your people's wisdom seems better suited to this land than many of the ideas I brought with me," she admitted. "Each way has value in its place," Maka replied, more diplomatic than she might have expected. "Your people's knowledge built this cabin, forged the knife I hunted with, created the medicines that helped heal my wounds alongside your native herbs." He made a balancing gesture with his hands. "The challenge is knowing which wisdom to apply in each moment." As night settled around the cabin, they established what was becoming a comfortable routine, sharing the rabbit stew, tending the fire, exchanging stories and knowledge in the flickering light. Maka spoke of his responsibilities as chief, the council of elders who helped guide significant decisions, the ceremonies that marked the changing seasons in his people's life. Rebecca, in turn, described the world she had left behind, the crowded streets of Philadelphia, the emerging industrial age with its factories and steam engines, the schools and libraries that had shaped her understanding of the world. "Your people value objects and machines," Maka observed without judgment. "Mine value relationships and connections to each other, to the land, to the spirits that dwell in all things." "Perhaps that's why we've had such difficulty understanding one another," Rebecca suggested. "We're looking at the same world through entirely different eyes." Maka considered this. "The eagle and the fox see the same meadow differently," he said after a thoughtful pause. "The eagle notes the patterns of movement below, the fox the scents and sounds around it. Neither view is wrong, but neither is complete alone." Rebecca smiled at the aptness of the analogy. "And here we are, trying to share what the eagle and the fox each see." "A rare thing," Maka acknowledged, a warmth in his eyes that hadn't been there in the early days of his recovery. "But perhaps a necessary one if our peoples are to find a way forward that doesn't end in more bloodshed." The conversation drifted to more immediate concerns as the evening progressed. Plans for Maka to attempt hunting larger game when his strength permitted, Rebecca's ideas for improving the smoking shed, shared knowledge about preserving food for the long winter months ahead. As they prepared for sleep, Rebecca added a final entry to her journal, recording not just the day's activities, but the insights their conversation had provided. She found herself writing with a new sense of purpose, aware that she was documenting something beyond her personal experience, a rare moment of cross-cultural understanding that few from either world would ever experience. Maka watched her from across the room, his expression thoughtful. "If you write of our conversations," he said quietly, "remember that some knowledge among my people is sacred, meant only for those who have earned the right to receive it." Rebecca looked up, suddenly concerned that she had overstepped a boundary. "Have I recorded something I shouldn't?" Maka shook his head slightly. "Not yet, but as trust grows between us, I may speak of things that are not meant for all ears. The white man's habit of writing everything down sometimes takes no account of what should remain unwritten." "I'll be careful," Rebecca promised, understanding the seriousness of his concern. "And I'll ask before recording anything that seems particularly meaningful to your traditions." This assurance seemed to satisfy him. As the fire burned low and the temperature outside dropped to dangerous levels, they settled into their respective sleeping places, the routine now familiar, almost comfortable despite the harsh circumstances surrounding them. Rebecca listened to the sounds of the night, the occasional pop from the fire, the creak of the cabin timbers adjusting to the cold, Maka's steady breathing as he drifted toward sleep. From enemies to reluctant allies to something approaching. Friendship, their relationship had evolved with surprising speed, shaped by necessity but growing beyond it. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. The continuing struggle for food, the ongoing battle against the cold, the constant vigilance required to survive in this unforgiving landscape. But for the first time since Thomas's death, Rebecca felt a fragile optimism taking root alongside her determination. With Maka's knowledge and her own resilience, perhaps they could do more than merely survive this winter. Perhaps they could find a way to thrive despite it, creating something neither could have managed alone. As sleep claimed her, Rebecca's last conscious thought was a silent gratitude for the strange twist of fate that had brought Maka to her door, wounded, desperate, but carrying with him exactly the wisdom and strength she had needed most. The days that followed fell into a rhythm dictated by necessity and the harsh winter conditions. Rebecca and Maka worked together to reinforce the cabin against the cold, patching gaps in the walls with a mixture of mud and dried grass that Minka showed her how to prepare, a technique his people had used for generations to insulate their winter lodges. Maka's strength returned gradually, his natural vitality reasserting itself as his wounds healed. By the 5th day after the great storm, he declared himself ready to attempt hunting larger game, despite Rebecca's lingering concerns about his condition. "The deer will have moved to lower elevations after the heavy snow," he explained, as he prepared Thomas's rifle, examining it with the careful respect of one who understood weapons as tools of survival rather than implements of war. "They will be seeking food in the sheltered valleys where the snow is not so deep." "Do you know how to use this?" Rebecca asked, watching as he checked the firing mechanism with practiced ease. A hint of amusement touched Maka's expression. "The Lakota have been trading for rifles since before your grandfather was born," he said. "My people adapted to this weapon quickly. It brings meat to the pot as surely as bow and arrow, and with less effort in skilled hands." He selected only a few of the precious cartridges Rebecca had stored away, knowing their value and scarcity. "I will make each shot count," he promised. "One deer, properly preserved, will feed us for many days." Rebecca helped him prepare, packing a small bundle of jerky for sustenance during the hunt and ensuring his clothing was adequate for the bitter cold. As he prepared to depart, an unexpected anxiety gripped her, a fear that once beyond the cabin, he might decide not to return, might try to reach his people despite the dangers. "You will come back," she said. The statement half question, half command. Maka studied her face, reading the concern there with his customary perception. "I have given my word to face this winter together," he reminded her quietly. "The Lakota do not break such promises lightly." The simple assurance eased her mind more than elaborate protestations might have done. Maka's straightforward honesty had become one of the characteristics she most valued in him, a stark contrast to the diplomatic evasions and social niceties that had characterized much of her previous life. "Be careful," she said simply as he shouldered the rifle. "Washtay," he replied, the Lakota word for agreement that he had taught her, his first attempt to share his language beyond isolated terms for plants and animals. Rebecca watched from the doorway as he moved away from the cabin, his figure soon becoming indistinct against the snowy landscape. The temperature had moderated slightly since the great storm, though it remained well below freezing. Overhead, the sky stretched vast and blue, deceptively serene given the deadly cold it presided over. Alone in the cabin for the first time in days, Rebecca set about her tasks with a new sense of purpose. No longer was she merely surviving from one day to the next. Now she was preparing for a future, creating a safe haven that would sustain both of them through the remaining winter months. She inventoried their supplies, noting what remained and what would need replenishing. She cleaned and organized the small space, making room for the meat that would need processing if Maka's hunt proved successful. She prepared the smoking shed as best she could, following the plans they had discussed together. Throughout these activities, Rebecca found herself reflecting on how much had changed in her perspective since Maka's arrival. Before, each day had been a grim battle against isolation and deprivation. Now, despite the continued hardships, she felt a renewed engagement with life, a curiosity about Maka's world, a desire to master the skills he was teaching her, an appreciation for the beauty that existed alongside the danger in this harsh landscape. As afternoon waned with no sign of Maka's return, Rebecca tried to quell her rising concern. Hunting required patience, she reminded herself, and traveling through deep snow would slow his progress considerably. Still, she found herself checking the window with increasing frequency as shadows lengthened across the pristine white landscape. The first hints of dusk were touching the western sky when Rebecca finally spotted movement at the tree line, a dark figure moving slowly through the snow. Relief washed over her, followed quickly by a new concern as she noticed Maka's labored progress. He appeared to be dragging something substantial behind him. Rebecca hurried outside, wading through the snow to meet him. As she drew closer, she saw the source of his burden. A young buck deer, its tawny body stark against the white ground. Maka himself looked exhausted, his face drawn with exertion, but triumph gleamed in his eyes. "You did it," Rebecca said, unable to keep the admiration from her voice. "The spirits were generous," Maka replied, his breath forming clouds in the frigid air. "One shot, clean and quick. No suffering." This last point seemed important to him, a matter of respect for the life he had taken to ensure their survival. Together, they managed to drag the deer the remaining distance to the cabin. The process of field dressing it had already been completed. Maka had done this despite his fatigue to prevent the meat from spoiling. Now the more detailed work of butchering and preserving would begin. Inside the warm cabin, Rebecca insisted that Maka rest briefly and take nourishment before they tackled this significant task. As he sipped hot tea and ate a small portion of stew she had prepared in his absence, he described the hunt, the tracking of deer signs through the snow, the patient waiting in a sheltered position, the careful shot that had brought down the buck from a considerable distance. "Your husband's rifle is well made," Maka noted, "true and balanced." "Thomas was particular about his tools," Rebecca said, a pang of memory touching her at the mention of her husband. "He believed in purchasing the best quality possible, even if it meant saving longer to afford it." "A wise approach," Maka agreed. "Poor tools bring poor results, whether in hunting or building." He set aside his empty bowl and rose, his brief rest having restored some of his energy. "Now we must honor the deer's sacrifice by using every part well." The next hours were consumed with the methodical process of butchering the deer carcass. Maka guided Rebecca through each step, teaching her to recognize the different cuts of meat, showing her how to separate sinew that could be dried and used for sewing, demonstrating how to scrape the hide to begin the tanning process that would eventually transform it into useful leather. "Nothing is wasted," he explained as they worked. "The meat feeds us, the hide will warm us, the bones can become tools, the antlers handles for knives or ornaments that honor the deer's spirit." Rebecca found herself impressed not just by the practicality of this approach, but by the underlying philosophy it represented, a perspective that viewed humans as part of the natural world rather than its masters, taking what was needed for survival while maintaining respect for the sacrifice involved. By the time they had completed the initial processing, hanging the meat in the cold shed where it would be safe from predators until they could smoke it properly, night had fallen. Completely. They were both exhausted, their hands chapped from the cold and the work, but a profound satisfaction pervaded the small cabin, the deep-seated contentment of having secured food that would sustain them through many difficult days ahead. As they washed away the blood and grime from their hands, Rebecca found herself studying Maka's profile in the flickering light from the fire. The lines of fatigue on his face couldn't disguise the essential strength and dignity of his features. In the days they had spent together, she had come to see beyond the superficial differences that might once have defined him in her eyes. The bronze skin, the distinctive facial structure, the long dark hair so different from the men of her previous world. Now she saw the individual beneath these external markers, a man of profound wisdom, practical intelligence, and unexpected gentleness despite his warrior status. A man who had suffered losses as grievous as her own, yet maintained his connection to life and meaning. A man whose presence had transformed her isolated existence in ways she was only beginning to fully comprehend. "You're staring," Maka observed without looking up from tending his hunting knife. Rebecca felt heat rise to her cheeks, embarrassed at being caught in such obvious contemplation. I was just thinking how fortunate I am that you were the one to collapse at my door, she admitted. Any other traveler might have brought danger rather than knowledge. Maka glanced up, a flicker of something indefinable passing through his dark eyes. Perhaps it was not fortune but design, he suggested. My people believe that spirits sometimes guide our steps when we are lost. Were you lost? Rebecca asked, realizing she had never heard the full story of how he had come to find her cabin. Maka set aside the knife, his expression growing distant as he recalled those desperate days. After escaping the soldiers, after the wolf attack, I wandered for 2 days, growing weaker from blood loss. The storm was beginning, visibility poor. I should have died in that snow. He looked directly at her now. Instead, I saw smoke from your chimney, the thinnest wisp against the grey sky. I followed it with the last of my strength, not knowing what I would find. You might have found hostile settlers, Rebecca pointed out. Many would have shot first and asked questions later, seeing a Lakota warrior at their door. I was beyond caring by then, Maka admitted. Death by bullet would have been quicker than freezing or bleeding out. A hint of his rare smile touched his lips. Instead, I found you, a woman with healing hands and a courageous heart. The simple compliment affected Rebecca more deeply than flowery praise might have done. In her previous life, she had been valued primarily for her social graces, her pleasing appearance, her suitable accomplishments in music and needlework. Maka saw and valued something more fundamental: her resilience, her willingness to learn, her ability to adapt to this harsh environment. We found each other, she corrected gently, and we're both stronger for it. As they prepared for sleep that night, the satisfaction of the successful hunt, combining with physical exhaustion to make rest especially welcome. Rebecca felt a shifting in her perception of their situation. What had begun as an emergency, the desperate care of a wounded stranger, had evolved into something much more complex and meaningful. They were no longer simply 2 people thrown together by circumstance, each enduring the other's presence out of necessity. They had become partners. In the fundamental enterprise of survival, their different backgrounds and knowledge complementing each other in ways that benefited both. More than that, they had formed a genuine connection that transcended their disparate origins, a friendship, or perhaps something more complicated that had no easy definition in either of their cultures. As the fire burned low and the cold pressed against the cabin walls, Rebecca found comfort in the sound of Maka's steady breathing from across the room. Whatever the future might hold, whatever challenges the remaining winter months might bring, they would face them together, no longer alone in a harsh and unforgiving land. The success of the deer hunt marked a turning point in their winter survival. With meat now carefully smoking in the shed, they had prepared together, using techniques Maka had demonstrated with patient precision. Their immediate concerns about starvation eased. For the first time since Thomas's death, Rebecca felt a cautious security about the weeks ahead. This newfound stability allowed both of them to turn their attention to other necessities. Maka fashioned crude but effective snowshoes from strips of deer hide and flexible green branches, tools that would make movement through the deep snow more manageable. Rebecca worked on tanning the deer hide under his guidance, a laborious process that would eventually yield valuable material for clothing repairs and other essential items. One clear morning about a week after the successful hunt, Maka announced his intention to explore further from the cabin, using the snowshoes to access areas that had been previously impassable. There may be other resources we can use, he explained as he prepared for the expedition. Pine sap for sealing and medicine, certain barks that remain useful even in winter, perhaps signs of more game. Is it safe to venture so far? Rebecca asked, concerned about the potential dangers. The temperature remained bitterly cold, despite occasional moderate days, and the snow in open areas was dangerously deep. With proper preparation, yes, Maka assured her. The snowshoes will prevent sinking, and I will follow the ridgeline where the wind has cleared some areas. I'll return before dusk. Rebecca nodded, accepting his assessment. Maka's knowledge of winter survival far exceeded her own, and she had learned to trust his judgment in these matters. Still, a lingering concern prompted her to prepare extra provisions for him to carry, just in case circumstances delayed his return. After his departure, Rebecca busied herself with indoor tasks that had been neglected during their focus on securing and preserving food. She mended clothing damaged during their outdoor labors, organized their growing collection of useful materials, and continued the never-ending battle against the cold that sought entry through every crack and crevice of the small cabin. As she worked, Rebecca found her thoughts continually returning to Maka and the complex relationship that had formed between them. In Philadelphia, she had moved in carefully segregated social circles where interactions followed predictable patterns established by generations of tradition. Here, she and Maka were writing their own rules of engagement, creating a shared language of cooperation and mutual respect that acknowledged their differences without allowing those differences to become barriers. Most surprising to Rebecca was how comfortable their daily interactions had become. The awkwardness of those first days, after Maka regained consciousness, had given way to an easy companionship, a natural division of labor based on skill and ability rather than prescribed roles. Maka never treated her as inferior, despite the physical strength and wilderness knowledge he possessed that she lacked. Instead, he approached their partnership as one between equals, each contributing what they could to their shared survival. Rebecca was still contemplating these thoughts when the cabin door opened in the late afternoon, admitting Maka along. With a blast of cold air, his cheeks were reddened from the cold, but satisfaction gleamed in his eyes as he set down a bulging leather pouch. "A successful journey," he announced, unwrapping the layers of fur and wool that had protected him from the bitter temperatures. Rebecca moved forward eagerly to examine his findings. The pouch contained an assortment of treasures, strips of resinous pine bark, useful for fire starting, a small quantity of pine sap with its medicinal properties, and most surprisingly, several handfuls of rose hips, their bright red standing out vividly against the other gathered materials. "Rose hips!" Rebecca exclaimed, recognizing the fruit from her mother's teaching about natural remedies. "They're rich in properties that prevent winter sickness." Maka nodded approvingly at her knowledge. "They remain on the branches even in deep winter, though hard to find beneath the snow. I discovered a large patch on a south-facing slope where the sun had melted some of the covering." Together, they sorted through his findings, Rebecca carefully storing the rose hips where they would dry properly. She would later use them for tea, a valuable supplement to their diet that might help prevent the scurvy that sometimes afflicted isolated settlers during long winters. "I saw something else," Maka said as they completed this task, his tone more serious. "Tracks in the snow about 3 miles east. Men on horseback, moving north. Soldiers, most likely, from their formation." Rebecca looked up sharply. "Recently. Yesterday. Perhaps before last night's light snow?" Maka's expression revealed little, but Rebecca had learned to read the subtle tension in his shoulders, the slight narrowing of his eyes that indicated concern. They weren't searching, merely passing through, but their presence so far from the fort is unusual in winter. The information hung between them, a reminder of the larger world beyond their isolated existence. A world where Maka was considered an enemy by men who wouldn't hesitate to shoot a Lakota warrior on sight, particularly one with his status. "Do you think they know about this cabin?" Rebecca asked, the practical implications immediately clear to her. "Unlikely," Maka replied after considering. "It's not on their usual patrol routes, and the recent storms have obscured most signs of habitation. The smoke from our chimney can be seen only from certain angles, and they were moving along the valley floor, not the ridges. Rebecca nodded, absorbing this assessment. Still, we should be cautious. Always, Maka agreed. I will check the eastern approach every few days. Watch for more signs. If they establish a pattern of movement through this area, we may need to adjust our activities. The simple "we" in his statement reassured Rebecca more than elaborate promises of protection might have done. Despite the potential danger his presence might bring to her homestead if discovered by hostile soldiers, Maka's first thought was for their mutual safety and continued survival. That evening, as they shared a meal of smoked venison and the last of Rebecca's preserved vegetables, Maka seemed pensive, more withdrawn than usual. Rebecca had learned to respect his periodic silences, understanding that in his culture, constant conversation wasn't expected or required. But something about his demeanor suggested thoughts that perhaps needed voicing. "What's troubling you?" she finally asked as they sat before the fire, its warm light casting flickering shadows across the cabin walls. Maka looked up, momentarily surprised by her perception. Then his expression softened slightly. "You've learned to read my face." "As you've learned to read mine," Rebecca countered with a small smile. "Is it the soldiers' tracks that concern you?" Maka was quiet for a moment, gathering his thoughts. "Partly," he admitted, "but also what they represent. Spring will come eventually, Rebecca. The snow will melt, travel will become possible again." He met her gaze directly. "What happens then?" The question touched on concerns that Rebecca had been carefully avoiding. The inevitable moment when their shared isolation would end, when choices would need to be made about futures that had seemed too distant to contemplate during the desperate focus on immediate survival. "I don't know," she answered honestly. "I haven't allowed myself to think that far ahead." "I must return to my people when the way clears," Maka said, his tone gentle but firm. "They need their chief, especially in these difficult times, with the treaty tensions growing worse." Rebecca nodded, a hollow feeling forming in her chest at the thought of his departure, of returning to complete solitude after these months of companionship and shared purpose. "I understand," she said quietly. "Your responsibilities to your tribe come first." "But what of you?" Maka pressed, genuine concern evident in his expression. "Will you remain here alone? The skills you've learned will help, but one person alone always faces greater danger, greater hardship." The question forced Rebecca to confront realities she had been avoiding. Before Maka's arrival, she had been slowly losing ground in her battle for survival, her determination gradually being eroded by isolation and the sheer difficulty of maintaining the homestead alone. The knowledge and assistance he had provided had changed that equation significantly, but once he departed, would she find herself in the same desperate situation as before? "I've considered returning east," she admitted. "Not to Philadelphia, but perhaps to one of the more established settlements along the Missouri. Places where a widow might find respectable work and community." Maka listened without interrupting, his dark eyes thoughtful. When she finished, he spoke carefully, weighing each word. "There is another possibility, though it may seem strange." "To your ears?" Rebecca looked at him questioningly. "Among my people there are sometimes those from outside who choose to join us," Maka explained. "Not many, but a few. Traders who married Lakota women and stayed. A few white captives who chose to remain even when given the chance to leave. Even a missionary's daughter who fell in love with our ways." Rebecca's breath caught as she understood what he was suggesting. "You mean I could go with you, to your people?" "It would not be easy," Maka cautioned immediately. "You would be viewed with suspicion by many. At least at first. The old wounds between our peoples run deep. You would need to learn our language, our customs, adapt to a very different way of life." His gaze was steady, honest. And I cannot promise how the elders would receive you, or what place you might eventually find among us. The possibility he offered was so unexpected, so far removed from anything Rebecca had considered, that she found herself momentarily speechless. To leave behind not just this homestead but the entire framework of the white settlers' world, to step fully into Maka's culture as a stranger seeking acceptance, the idea was simultaneously terrifying and strangely compelling. "Why would you offer this?" she finally asked. "Why take the risk of bringing a white woman to your people, especially now when tensions are so high?" Maka considered the question with appropriate seriousness. "Because you saved my life when you could. Have let me die or turn me away," he said simply. "Because you've shown a willingness to learn and understand ways different from your own. Because—" He paused, something vulnerable briefly visible in his normally guarded expression. "Because the thought of riding away knowing you, face the winter alone, sits poorly in my heart." The admission carried more weight than flowery declarations might have done. Rebecca understood enough of Maka's character now to know that he spoke rarely of his feelings, that such a statement represented significant trust. "I don't know what to say," she confessed. "It's not a decision I can make in a moment." "Nor should you," Maka agreed. "The snow will remain deep for many weeks yet. There is time to consider, to ask questions, to understand what such a choice would truly mean." His expression remained open, without pressure or expectation. "I offer only a possibility, not a demand." Rebecca nodded, grateful for his understanding. The idea he had presented would require careful thought, an honest assessment of what her future might hold, whether she remained at the homestead, returned to white settlements, or took the unprecedented step of joining Maka's people. As they prepared for sleep that night, the question hung in the air between them, unresolved but not uncomfortable, a new path to consider alongside those Rebecca had previously imagined for herself. Outside, the cold intensified as darkness deepened, stars emerging in a sky of crystalline clarity. Inside, the fire burned steadily, its light encompassing two people from different worlds, temporarily united by circumstance. But perhaps Rebecca now realized, connected by something deeper and more enduring than mere necessity. The days that followed Maka's unexpected suggestion were filled with quiet industry and unspoken questions. Rebecca found herself contemplating possibilities that would have seemed unthinkable months earlier. To join the Lakota people, to cross not just geographical boundaries but cultural ones as well, was a step few white women had ever taken voluntarily. Yet the more she considered it, the more she recognized that her life had already been irrevocably altered by her experiences in this harsh land and by her time with Maka. She was no longer the proper Philadelphian lady who had followed her husband west with naive enthusiasm. That woman had died slowly during the lonely months after Thomas's passing, replaced by someone more resilient, more pragmatic, and perhaps more willing to consider unconventional paths. For his part, Maka neither pressed the issue nor avoided it. He answered Rebecca's tentative questions about his people's daily life with straightforward honesty, describing both the beauty of their traditions and the harsh realities they faced in a changing world. He taught her more words in his language, practical terms for common objects and actions, the proper greetings for elders and children, expressions that might help her navigate initial interactions if she chose to accompany him. "Your tongue is skilled," he observed with rare praise after she mastered a particularly difficult phrase. "Many whites never learned to shape our words properly." "I had a gift for languages even as a child," Rebecca explained. "My father insisted. I learned French and a little German, though I never thought I'd be studying Lakota instead of European tongues." Maka nodded thoughtfully. The ability to speak in many voices is valuable. Among my people, those who can speak both Lakota and English often serve as bridges between worlds. A shadow crossed his face. Though such bridges are becoming harder to maintain as trust erodes on both sides, the reality of the wider conflict that surrounded their isolated idyll was never far from consciousness. Every few days, Maka ventured out to check for signs of military patrols or other travelers who might pose a threat. Twice more he spotted distant tracks that suggested soldiers moving through the area, though never approaching the cabin directly. Each sighting reinforced both the temporary nature of their security and the genuine danger Maka would face if discovered. One evening in late January, as a particularly bitter cold snap descended on the region, Rebecca finally gave voice to concerns that had been building within her. "If I were to go with you," she began carefully as they sat before the fire, "would my presence put you at greater risk? Would your people resent you for bringing a white woman among them?" Maka set aside the arrowhead he had been crafting from Deerbone, a project undertaken more to keep his hands busy during the long evenings than from immediate necessity. His expression grew serious as he considered her questions. "There would be risk," he acknowledged. "Some of our young warriors are bitter after repeated betrayals by white authorities, broken treaties, encroachment on our lands. They might view you with suspicion or even hostility at first." He met her gaze directly. "But you would be under my protection as chief. That counts for much, though not everything." Rebecca appreciated his honesty, his refusal to minimize the potential difficulties. "And the elders? The women of the tribe?" "The elders remember a time when relations between our peoples were less poisoned," Maka replied. "Some might see a value in having someone who understands the white man's ways among us, especially one who has shown willingness to learn our traditions." He paused. "The women would judge you by your actions, your willingness to work alongside them, to contribute to the community's well-being." Rebecca nodded, absorbing this assessment. "I would try," she said simply. "I've never feared hard work." "I know," Maka responded, a warmth in his tone that had become more frequent in recent weeks. "I've seen your strength, your determination. These qualities are valued among my people, perhaps more than among yours." The observation struck Rebecca as profoundly true. In Philadelphia society, a woman's strength was often dismissed as unfeminine, her practical abilities secondary to social graces and ornamental accomplishments. The frontier had begun to change these perceptions by necessity, but even among settlers, a woman's independent capabilities were frequently undervalued. "Tell me about the women in your tribe," Rebecca requested. "What are their lives like?" Maka seemed pleased by her interest. "Lakota women are the heart of our people," he began. "They maintain the home, what you would call tipis, prepare food, create clothing and tools from the animals we hunt, raise the children, preserve our stories and traditions." His expression softened with respect. "A man may be a great warrior or hunter, but without women's work he would have no home to return to, no food to sustain him, no clothing to protect him from the elements." "That sounds similar to women's work in my culture," Rebecca observed, "though perhaps not always valued as it should be." "Among the Lakota, a woman's work is recognized as essential," Maka continued. "Women own the tipi and everything in it. They have voice in tribal decisions, especially the older women of wisdom. Some even participate in certain sacred ceremonies alongside men." He paused. "It is different from what I have observed of white women's place." The comparison gave Rebecca much to consider. While she had no illusions that life among the Lakota would be easy, particularly as an outsider, there were aspects of their social organization that seemed to offer women a more acknowledged role than she had experienced in white society. Before she could respond, A sound outside the cabin froze them both, the distant but distinctive crack of a rifle shot echoing across the snow-covered landscape. Maka was on his feet instantly, moving to the window with the silent grace that still surprised Rebecca. Despite their months together, he peered cautiously through a gap in the shutters, his body tense with alertness. "Could be a hunter," Rebecca suggested quietly, though anxiety had already begun to curl in her stomach. "Perhaps," Maka conceded, though his tone suggested doubt. "But few would hunt in darkness unless desperate." He continued his careful surveillance for several minutes, but no further sounds disturbed the winter night. "We should extinguish the lamp," he finally said. "Keep only the fire, which is less visible from a distance." Rebecca complied without question, understanding the precaution. They spent the remainder of the evening in the dim glow of the banked fire, conversation muted, both listening intently for any further indication of human presence in their vicinity. No additional disturbances occurred, but the incident served as a stark reminder of their vulnerability. The following morning, Maka rose before dawn, dressed warmly and prepared to scout the surrounding area. "I must know who fired that shot," he explained, as Rebecca helped him gather supplies for the expedition. "Whether it represents threat or merely another survivor of the winter." "Be careful," Rebecca urged, the phrase having become a ritual between them whenever either ventured beyond the cabin's relative safety. "If it's soldiers, I will observe only, not engage," Maka assured her. "Information is what we need, not confrontation." With that promise, he departed, moving swiftly on the snowshoes he had crafted. Rebecca watched until he disappeared among the trees, then turned to her daily tasks with determined focus, though anxiety remained a constant companion. The morning passed with excruciating slowness. Rebecca found herself checking the window, far more frequently than necessary, straining for any glimpse of Maka's returning figure. By midday, with no sign of him, she had to force herself to eat a small meal, knowing that maintaining her strength was essential regardless of her concern. Early afternoon brought the first flakes of yet another snowstorm, light at first, but quickly intensifying as wind rose from the north. Rebecca's worry deepened. If Maka was still far from the cabin when the storm reached full strength, even his considerable wilderness skills might not be sufficient to ensure his safe return. She was considering whether to light the lamp as a beacon, despite the potential risk, when the cabin door finally opened, admitting a snow-covered Maka along with a swirl of wind-driven flakes. Relief flooded through Rebecca as she hurried to secure the door behind him. "You're back," she said simply, helping him remove his ice-encrusted outer layers. Maka nodded, his expression grave as he moved to warm himself by the fire. "Just ahead of the storm," he acknowledged. "It comes from the northwest, a powerful one that will last through tomorrow at least." "Did you find who fired the shot?" Rebecca asked, pouring him a cup of hot tea from the pot she had kept ready. "Yes." Maka accepted the tea gratefully, his hands still stiff with cold despite his gloves. "A small patrol of soldiers, 5 men from Fort Laramie, I believe. They had made camp about 4 miles southwest of here." Rebecca frowned. "So far from the fort in winter? That seems unusual." "Very," Maka agreed. "From what I observed, they appear to be searching for something, or someone." His gaze met hers meaningfully. "Their presence here is no coincidence or routine patrol." The implication hung heavily in the air between them. "You think they're looking for you specifically?" Rebecca asked, voicing the concern. They both felt. Maka sipped his tea before answering, gathering his thoughts. "The soldiers I encountered before finding your cabin would have reported the engagement to their superiors. A wounded Lakota chief would be considered worth pursuing, especially one they believe has information about our people's winter camp locations." "But that was months ago," Rebecca protested. Surely they wouldn't still be searching after all this time, particularly in these conditions. The army can be persistent, Maka replied grimly, and a Lakota chief is a valuable prize in their ongoing efforts to force our people onto reservations. He set down his cup, his expression resolute. I need to leave, Rebecca. My presence here puts you in danger. No! The vehemence of her own response surprised Rebecca as much as it did Maka. The storm is already building. You'd never survive a journey of any distance in these conditions. I've survived worse, he countered, though without real conviction. They both knew the danger posed by a Dakota blizzard, even the most experienced. Traveler could quickly become disoriented and freeze to death within hours. The soldiers have made camp, Rebecca reasoned, struggling to maintain a calm she didn't entirely feel. They won't move during the storm either. We have time to consider our options more carefully. Maka studied her face, recognizing the determination there. After a tense moment, he nodded once, accepting the logic of her argument, if not completely. Abandoning his concern, we will use the storm as cover, he conceded. But when it passes, I must draw them away from here. Your safety depends on it. Rebecca wanted to argue further, but recognized the futility. Instead, she busied herself preparing a more substantial meal, knowing Maka would need to restore his strength after hours trekking through deep snow. As they ate, she formulated and discarded various plans, searching for a solution that wouldn't involve Maka facing the soldiers alone or struggling through the winter wilderness without shelter. Outside, the storm intensified, snow accumulating rapidly as winds screamed around the cabin corners like a living thing seeking entry. Inside, two people from different worlds faced a threat that had suddenly made their private sanctum feel perilously exposed. A reminder that the conflict between their peoples continued unabated beyond the temporary peace they had established between themselves. That night, as they prepared for sleep with the howling storm as fierce accompaniment, Rebecca made a decision that had been forming in her mind since Maka's return. If the soldiers were indeed searching specifically for him, if his presence truly threatened both their safety, then the time for indecision had passed. Whatever came next, they would face it together, not as individuals from opposed cultures, but as allies who had forged a bond stronger than the artificial boundaries that separated their peoples. The storm raged for 2 days, transforming the landscape into an unrecognizable expanse of white. Inside the cabin, Rebecca and Maka used the enforced isolation to prepare for what would come when the weather cleared. They spoke in low voices, despite the howling wind that would have drowned out any possibility of being overheard, a habit born of their new wariness. The soldiers cannot move in this weather any more than we can, Maka observed, as they shared a breakfast of smoked venison and the tea made from rose hips he had gathered. But when the storm passes, they will resume their search. I've been thinking about that, Rebecca said, her expression resolute. If they're looking specifically for you, they'll be watching for signs of a Lakota warrior traveling alone. Maka nodded, following her reasoning. What they won't expect is a white settler woman and her Indian guide. The plan had formed in Rebecca's mind during the long night as she listened to the storm's fury. Bold, perhaps reckless, but with a logic that became more compelling the more she considered it. Exactly, she confirmed. Thomas and I were headed further west before we decided to settle here. I still have the papers showing our intended destination near the Colorado border. She met Maka's gaze directly. If we're stopped, I can claim we're traveling to meet my brother, who established a homestead there last year. You're the guide I hired in Fort Laramie after my husband's death. Maka considered the strategy, his expression thoughtful. It might work with ordinary soldiers, he acknowledged. They often cannot distinguish between different tribal appearances, but if their commander has experience with the Lakota, we'll need to alter your appearance. Rebecca agreed. Cut your hair, change your clothing style. She hesitated, knowing what she suggested represented a significant cultural sacrifice for him. I wouldn't ask this if I saw another way. Maka was silent for a long moment, his hand unconsciously moving to touch the long black hair that, among his people, symbolized both pride and spiritual connection. For a warrior of his status to cut it was no small matter. There are more important things than appearance, he finally said, his voice quiet but firm. The safety of both our lives outweighs symbolic traditions, no matter how meaningful. The simple statement revealed volumes about Maka's character, his pragmatism in the face of necessity, his willingness to adapt when survival required it. Rebecca felt a surge of respect for this resilience, this capacity to distinguish between essential principles and customs that, while important, could be temporarily set aside. What about your plan to draw them away? She asked. Has that changed? Maka nodded slowly. Your strategy offers a better chance for both of us. To separate now would leave each of us more vulnerable. He studied her face. But you must be certain, Rebecca. If we travel together, as you suggest, there can be no turning back to this place. The journey will be difficult, dangerous, with no guarantee of success. I'm certain, Rebecca replied without hesitation. This cabin holds too many memories now. Of Thomas, of our time together, of soldiers searching nearby. Whatever comes next, it can't be here. The decision made, they turned to practical preparations. Rebecca gathered essential supplies that could be carried on the single horse that had survived the winter in the small lean-to stable behind the cabin. Maka fashioned a crude sled that could be pulled behind the horse, allowing them to transport more food and equipment than would otherwise be possible. On the morning of the third day, the storm finally abated, leaving behind a transformed world of sculptured drifts and dangerous beauty. The temperature remained bitterly cold, but the sky had cleared to a crystalline blue that promised at least temporary respite from snow. It's time, Maka said quietly as they stood at the cabin window, surveying the altered landscape. Rebecca nodded, a complex mixture of emotions washing through her. Apprehension about the journey ahead, sadness at leaving the homestead she and Thomas had established with such hope, yet also a strange sense of liberation, of moving toward something rather than merely surviving in place. They completed their final preparations in focused silence. Rebecca donned her warmest clothing, layer upon layer, designed to protect against the cold they would face. She packed her journal and a few small mementos from her previous life, her mother's cameo, Thomas's pocket watch, items that connected her to a past that seemed increasingly distant. The most difficult moment came when Maka seated himself on a stool before the fire and handed Rebecca a pair of shears she had found among Thomas's tools. "Cut it all," he instructed, his voice steady, despite what Rebecca knew this sacrifice cost him. Leave no sign of a Lakota warrior's appearance. Rebecca's hands trembled slightly as she began the task, carefully cutting away the long black hair that fell past Maka's shoulders. With each snip of the shears, dark strands dropped to the cabin floor, symbolic threads connecting Maka to his identity as a chief severed one by one. He remained utterly still throughout the process, his expression unreadable, though Rebecca sensed the profound significance of this act. When she had finished, Maka looked years younger, his strong features more prominent without the frame. Of long hair, dressed in a combination of his own buckskin leggings and Thomas's old coat and hat, he might pass as a half-breed guide to casual observation, still visibly native, but without the distinctive markers of a Lakota warrior. "It's done," Rebecca said softly, setting aside the shears. Maka rose and gathered the cut hair from the floor, carefully wrapping it in a small piece of leather. In my culture, hair holds spirit, he explained, tucking the package into his garments. It must be treated with respect, not left behind. Rebecca nodded, understanding this wasn't merely superstition, but a profound spiritual belief that deserved honor regardless of her own traditions. By mid-morning, they were ready to depart. The horse, a sturdy buckskin mare named Willow, stood patiently as they secured their supplies to the improvised sled. The cold bit at any exposed skin with vicious intensity, but the clear sky and still air were as favorable as they could hope. For in the depths of winter, before leaving, Rebecca took a final walk through the cabin that had been first her home with Thomas, then her solitary prison, and finally a place of unexpected connection with Maka. Each corner held memories, some painful, some precious, that she committed silently to memory, knowing she would likely never see this place again. "Are you ready?" Maka asked gently, standing in the doorway. Rebecca nodded, taking a deep breath of the cabin's familiar air one last time. "Yes," she replied, turning away from the past and toward whatever future awaited them. They set out heading west initially, not their intended final direction, but a strategic choice to create distance between themselves and the soldiers' last known position. Maka led Willow through the deep snow, creating a path that Rebecca followed, both of them using the snowshoes he had crafted to prevent sinking into the treacherous drifts. Progress was painfully slow. Even with the snowshoes, each step required significant effort, and the bitter cold sapped their strength despite the physical exertion. By midday, they had covered perhaps 3 miles, a fraction of what might be possible in better conditions, but a solid beginning given the circumstances. They paused briefly to rest and consume some of the jerky they had packed, standing rather than sitting to avoid the deadly cold of the snow. Willow snorted clouds of steam, her coat rimmed with frost, despite the blanket Rebecca had draped over her. "We should reach the ridge by nightfall," Maka said, gesturing toward a line of trees, visible in the distance. "There's a sheltered hollow I know of. Not ideal, but better protection than open ground." Rebecca nodded, conserving her energy rather than speaking unnecessarily. The cold seemed to crystallize the very air in her lungs, making each breath a conscious effort. She had experienced winter cold during her months at the cabin, but never while traveling through it, hour after hour, without respite. They resumed their journey, each step a small victory against the elements. As afternoon began to wane, Rebecca found herself focusing on the steady rhythm of movement. Place snowshoe, shift weight, advance, repeat. A meditation of survival that required total concentration. The sun was low on the horizon, casting long, blue shadows across the snow when Maka suddenly raised his hand in a signal to stop. Rebecca froze instantly, reading the tension in his posture. He pointed silently toward the ridge ahead, where movement was just visible among the trees. Rebecca's heart sank as she made out the unmistakable outlines of men on horseback, at least 3 figures moving along the very ridge they had been heading toward. The soldiers had resumed their search more quickly than anticipated, and their path would intersect directly with the one Rebecca and Maka were following. With the setting sun behind them, Rebecca and Maka were perfectly silhouetted against the snow, visible for miles in the crystal-clear winter air. There was no time to hide, no cover available in the open expanse they had been crossing. Discovery was inevitable. Maka moved swiftly to Rebecca's side, his voice low and urgent. "Remember the story," he reminded her. "You are a widow traveling to your brother's homestead. I am your hired guide from Fort Laramie. Show no fear, no hesitation." Rebecca nodded, squaring her shoulders despite the dread pooling in her stomach. "What if they recognize you?" "Then we face what comes," Maka replied simply. "Together." The word carried more meaning than its simple syllables might suggest. A promise, a commitment, a bond forged through months of shared survival and growing understanding. Whatever happened in the next moments, they would meet it not as individuals, from opposed worlds, but as partners who had chosen a common path. The soldiers had spotted them now, changing direction to ride directly toward them across the snow. As the distance closed, Rebecca could make out details: blue uniforms, rifles held at the ready, expressions of suspicion clearly visible even at a distance. "Here they come," Maka murmured, his calm voice belying the danger they faced. "Stand. The tall Rebecca Mitchell, show them the strength I know you possess." Rebecca straightened, one hand resting on Willow's neck for reassurance, the other holding firmly to the documents that might determine their fate. The soldiers were close enough now that she could hear the creaking of their saddles, see the plumes of steam from their horses' nostrils. The patrol leader, a sergeant with a weather-beaten face and suspicious eyes, raised his hand to halt his men within speaking distance. His gaze moved from Rebecca to Maka, and back again, assessment and wariness evident in his expression. "Ma'am," he began, touching the brim of his hat in a gesture that seemed incongruously polite, given the rifles his men held ready. "Mighty unusual to find folks traveling in these conditions. Mind telling me what brings you out here?" Rebecca met his gaze steadily, projecting a confidence she didn't entirely feel. "My name is Rebecca Mitchell," she began, her voice clear, in the stillness of the winter afternoon. "I'm traveling to my brother's homestead near the Colorado border. This is my guide, John." The sergeant's eyes narrowed as he studied Maka more carefully. "Your guide, you say? Interesting choice of companion for a lady alone. My husband died of fever 3 months ago," Rebecca continued, the practiced story flowing naturally. "I cannot maintain our homestead alone, and my brother sent word offering shelter. The guide was recommended in Fort Laramie as knowing the beast's winter trails." The sergeant dismounted, approaching to examine the documents Rebecca held out. As he reached for them, his gaze met Maka's directly, and in that moment Rebecca saw recognition flicker in the soldier's eyes. The sun touched the horizon, casting its final golden light across the snow, as 2 worlds collided on a desolate plain in the Dakota Territory. What happened next would determine not just their immediate fate, but the course of lives that had become unexpectedly, irrevocably intertwined. As dawn broke 1 week later, Rebecca Mitchell stood on a small rise, overlooking a vast encampment of teepees arranged in the traditional circle of a Lakota winter camp. Smoke rose from cooking fires into the clear morning air, and children's voices carried across the snow-covered ground as they began their daily activities. Beside her stood Maka, his hair still short but now adorned with a single eagle feather, symbol of his restored status among his people. The journey that had brought them to this moment had tested every resource they possessed, every bond they had formed during their months together. The confrontation with the soldiers on that sunset-painted snowfield could have ended in tragedy. The sergeant's recognition of Maka as a Lakota chief, rather than a simple guide, had been a moment of supreme danger, a heartbeat when life and death balanced on the edge of a decision. What neither Rebecca nor Maka could have anticipated was the sergeant's next words, spoken quietly after a long, tense silence. "My sister married a Cheyenne man 10 years ago, lives with his people now." His weathered face had revealed complex emotions as he added, "Never understood her choice until I saw how they treated her after she fell ill, with more respect than her own family had shown." That unexpected revelation had shifted the encounter, from potential violence to wary negotiation. The sergeant had his orders to search for a Lakota chief, believed to be gathering intelligence for resistance against the army. But the woman before him, clearly educated, clearly determined, complicated the simple narrative he'd been given. In the end, he had made a choice that defied his orders, but perhaps honored something deeper, a recognition of humanity that transcended the artificial boundaries of race and culture. He had returned Rebecca's documents, offered gruff advice about safer routes west, and led his patrol away with a final warning. Don't head north. Major Harrison's company is sweeping that area, and they're not known for asking questions before they shoot. Now, standing before the Lakota winter camp, Rebecca faced a new beginning more radical than any she had previously imagined. The tribe's initial reception had been cautious, suspicious stares, whispered consultations among the elders, women drawing children away from the strange white woman who arrived with their chief. But Mahka's status, combined with the story of how she had saved his life at risk to her own, had earned her a tentative acceptance, not integration, not yet. That would take time, effort, practical demonstration of her willingness to learn and contribute. But a beginning, a chance, an opportunity to forge a life that bridged two worlds rather than being fully rooted in either. Are you certain? Mahka asked quietly beside her, the question encompassing all the challenges that lay ahead, learning a new language and culture, adapting to a nomadic lifestyle far different from her settled past, facing potential prejudice from both native people suspicious of her origins and white authorities who would view her choice as betrayal. Rebecca turned to him, seeing the man who had transformed from wounded stranger to teacher to partner in survival. The bond between them had grown into something neither had anticipated, not just respect or friendship, but a deeper connection that transcended cultural differences. I'm certain, she replied simply, her gaze steady. This is where I belong now. As the sun rose fully above the eastern horizon, casting golden light across the winter landscape, Rebecca Mitchell took her first steps toward the Lakota camp, not as an outsider or visitor, but as a woman who had made her choice with clear eyes and full heart. The path ahead would not be easy, but it would be hers, freely chosen, rich with possibilities that neither her past in Philadelphia nor her isolated existence at the cabin could have offered. Behind her lay the trappings of one life, abandoned by necessity, transformed by experience. Before her lay the unknown terrain of another, challenging, complex, but vibrant with the promise of genuine connection. And beside her walked Mahka, the unlikely bridge between these worlds, whose wounded arrival at her door that winter day had set in motion a journey neither could have imagined. As they approached the camp, the first tentative greetings were called out. Children paused in their play to stare with undisguised curiosity, and elders emerged from their teepees to assess this unprecedented addition to their community. Rebecca stood tall, ready to face whatever came next, with the same courage that had carried her through the long Dakota winter. At dawn, 1 week later, Rebecca Mitchell didn't know what the future held, only that she would meet it on her own terms, in the company of people who valued strength, resilience, and the wisdom to recognize that sometimes the most meaningful boundaries are not those drawn on maps or between cultures, but those we choose to cross in pursuit of a life that honors our deepest truths. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.